I've been watching The Simpsons since I was in grade school, and the show has had a huge impact on my sense of humor, values, and view of the world. When I was young, I identified most with Bart and Lisa, being literally their ages when I started watching the show. Though now that I approach Homer in age, I've come to appreciate Dan Castellaneta's character the most. The show is the longest running in history, exceeding its closest competitor, Law and Order, by 10 years. When The Simpsons first released, it was famous for its subversive comedy, making it a countercultural icon that redefined the sitcom, showing that a dysfunctional and realistic family can be on television. Prior to The Simpsons, fathers were shown as wise and industrious, models of good behavior. Children were shown as conforming and diligent in school, not as symbols of cultural subversion, like Bart. It's hard to describe just how much The Simpsons changed the culture of the United States. Huge shifts in our understandings of morality and propriety were pioneered by the show. It's hard to imagine now Bart being a shocking character, but by the standards of the 90s, he was. Bart failed in school, used rude language, and took the head off the statue of Jebediah Springfield. Modern shows like South Park, Game of Thrones, and Rick and Morty owe a lot to the cultural liberalization that was a product of the show. In the early Simpsons, the show embraced realism, trying to portray a flawed and authentic family. Only later did it embrace its opportunities as an animated show, becoming more outlandish in its scenarios. Most viewers of The Simpsons look nostalgically back on its first 9 seasons, referred to as the golden age of the show. After this, the show was seen as falling into decline, still on air but no longer the cultural bellwether that it was on its release. Fundamentally, the show was a product of the 90s and its culture, and though it retained some of its zeitgeist through the early 2000s, it declined in relevance afterward. Despite this, the characters retained their iconic status, with Homer, Bart, and Lisa becoming archetypes not just for the American family, but for the everyman, the contrarian thinker, and the counterculture too. Having watched and rewatched The Simpsons for years, I wanted to ponder the question of, what is the best episode of the show? Given The Simpsons is one of the best written programs of all time, and has had such a huge influence on the American consciousness, identifying what this episode is may give us some insight into understanding what is excellent. While The Simpsons is a great program, there are a few episodes which spring forth out of the list as being particularly exceptional. These are Cape Fear, You Only Move Twice, Homer's Enemy, and The Shinning, which is a short in the 5th Treehouse of Horror episode. These episodes are some of the most creative and iconic, containing some of the most memorable and beloved characters, tell compelling narratives, demonstrate how dynamic animation can be as a medium, and contain some of the best references and jokes. Let's break down each of them and try to assess what makes them great. Cape Fear is a satire of the film of the same name and is an episode built around Kelsey Grammer's character on the show, Sideshow Bob. Put in prison for trying to frame Krusty the Clown, Bob blames Bart for this, whose efforts got him captured and jailed. Filled with resentment, Bob schemes in prison and plans to take his revenge. The episode starts with Bob sending Bart murderous letters, each one penned using his blood as ink. Though Homer initially thinks they're addressed to him, they terrify Bart, who realizes it must be Bob sending the letters. Despite the episode's dark premise, it's heavy in comedy. After finishing another letter to Bart, Bob is shown using his blood to write a to-do list, which causes him to faint to the floor. His cellmate, Snake, exclaims that he should use a pen instead. When put before the parole board, it's clear Bob hates the justice system, is a real danger to Bart, and is devoted to getting revenge against him. He even has a tattoo that portrays his desire to kill him. Hilariously, the parole board believes all his excuses and decides to release him. Bob then begins threatening Bart in person, seeing the family at a movie in a scene similar to Cape Fear, and drives by their house with loudspeakers, announcing his harmlessness to everyone on Evergreen Terrace, except Bart. After learning of Bob's intentions, Bart and his family decide to go into hiding in the Witness Protection Program. After being shown several locations, and with Homer clearly not understanding the idea of a secret identity, they relocate to Terror Lake, where they begin living on a houseboat. The episode then makes a satire of the opening sequence, with the family rushing to their new home where they live on the lake. On arriving, the Simpsons joke if they don't like their neighbors, they can always sail away, only for all the families next to them to immediately raise anchor and escape from them. Homer also arrives in Terror Lake wearing a hat from the Witness Protection Program, which is one of my favorite visual jokes from the show. While the family drives to Terror Lake, Bob catches a ride with them by tying himself to the bottom of their car. Despite the horror of him doing this, the show makes it into a joke by torturing him and making light of the family's cluelessness about him. When Homer drives through the Badlands, he asks the kids if they want to drive through a cactus patch, with Bart and Lisa saying yes, and Bob beneath the car exclaiming no. 2 against 1, Homer says, oblivious he just responded to the murderer who wants to kill his son. One of the most famous jokes of the episode happens when Bob finally gets out from under the car, then walks into a series of rakes, shuddering angrily each time. The humor of the scene lies in how long the writers maintain the joke, extending it for far longer than a conventional one would have ended. In Terror Lake, Bob surprises Bart in town, revealing himself under the car of an old woman before untying himself and threatening him while lying in a public street. Bob just induces more suffering for himself, causing another joke where he's being trampled on by a parade of elephants marching through the town. In the evening, Bob appears on the houseboat, ambushing Bart's family and tying them up so he can hunt Bart alone. Bob corners Bart, who can't escape due to the alligators and eels swimming in the waters below. Having finally beaten Bart, Bob asks if he has any last wishes. In one of the funniest scenes of the show, Bart asks the classically educated Bob if he can sing the score of the HMS Pinafore to him before killing him. Bart hopes to buy time before the ship reaches Springfield. Hilariously, Bob agrees, and we get several cuts of Kelsey Grammer singing songs from the opera, which he does well. After concluding, Bob goes to finish Bart when the ship crashes on the shore, disarming Bob and sending him into the arms of the Springfield police, who arrest him. The episode ends, Bob returns to jail, and the Simpsons go back to Springfield. This episode has some of the best jokes in the show, like the rake sequence, Kelsey Grammer singing Gilbert and Sullivan, and Homer barging into Bart's room with a chainsaw and hockey mask. The episode has a frightening theme, based on revenge and murder, but executes it lightly using the Simpsons' characteristic humor. Well-structured and efficient, the episode tells an engaging narrative from start to finish, and has some of the best absurdist humor of the entire show. You Only Move Twice is an Al Brooks episode of The Simpsons. In it, he plays a supervillain, Hank Scorpio, who Homer gets a job working for. The comedy of the episode lies in Homer's excellent treatment by the character. Homer's new boss, despite planning to take over the world, is portrayed as a generous and good-natured person. He gives his employees generous benefits and is always available to talk to. The episode begins with Scorpio's assistant following Smithers in her car, pulling up beside him and offering him a job at Globex. We learn later that Scorpio is working on a project to rule the world called Project Arcturus, and he needs experienced nuclear technicians to do this. When Smithers refuses the job, she goes to the next most senior member at the plant, Homer, who accepts. Back at home, Marge, Lisa, and Bart are arguing when Homer puts on the promotional video for Cypress Creek, the corporate town for Scorpio's company. A planned community, it has no homelessness, good schools, a thriving commercial center, and large quality homes for its employees. After watching it and acknowledging all the ways they don't like Springfield, the family agrees to leave their home behind and move to the new town. Arriving in Cypress Creek, they're greeted by Homer's new boss, Hank Scorpio, who makes an in-person visit. Extroverted and friendly, he has some of the most unique dialogue in the history of the show, a consequence of Al Brooks improvising his lines with Castellaneta in the recording studio, and the directors deciding to incorporate them into the episode. The same friendly exchange happens during Homer's first day at work, when Scorpio encourages him with his dream to own the Dallas Cowboys, something Homer's family had laughed at him about earlier. Scorpio says he knows how Homer feels, saying people laughed at him when he was the first person to wear jeans with a sport coat. Scorpio then introduces Homer to his job, which is a role as a supervisor. What's unique is the job is purely motivational, and doesn't require any skills, which actually makes it a great fit for Homer. When he starts doing it, Homer is shown treating his workers well, following the same relational style in dealing with them as Scorpio has with him. Homer gets the idea to get hammocks for his workers and visits Scorpio in his office, asking where he can get some. Scorpio hilariously thinks this is a great idea and directs Homer to get them from the hammock district in Cypress Creek. Scorpio then phones the UN, showing the true nature of his character, blowing up a bridge and demanding a ransom, or else he'll cause more destruction. Homer continues working at the job, getting along well with Scorpio and failing to understand his true nature as a supervillain. While getting candy from a vending machine, Homer tackles a secret agent trying to escape the company. Homer thanks Scorpio and tells him he'll add another story on his house. Despite everything going well for Homer, the new town is a nightmare for the rest of the family. Marge finds out the technology of the house takes care of her cleaning and mothering, causing her to start drinking out of a lack of purpose. Lisa develops terrible allergies while skipping in the forest, finding herself allergic to the serene nature of Cypress Creek. At school, Bart is initially popular, then finds himself put in the remedial class due to not having learned cursive in Springfield, making him miserable. When Homer goes home and tells his family how well work is going for him, they confront him, sharing their negative experiences and saying they want to move back to Springfield. Homer tries to convince them they should stay, but decides he'll talk to Scorpio about it under their pressure. Homer visits Scorpio, finding the company is under attack by the authorities. Still unaware of the true nature of the situation, Scorpio takes time during the siege to have a heart-to-heart conversation with Homer. Though disappointed, Scorpio tells Homer he should do what is right for his family and move back to Springfield, because it's the little things that make up life. He then laughs maniacally and begins blasting his foes with a flamethrower as Homer exits the facility. On returning home, the Simpsons move back into their condemned house. Otto, who was squatting there, gets his girlfriend and leaves. The episode then ends with Homer receiving a gift from Scorpio. The supervillain, having taken over the East Coast, thanks Homer for his help and gives him the Denver Broncos. Not what Homer wanted, but one step closer to his dream. You Only Move Twice is one of the most unique episodes of the show and takes advantage of The Simpsons as an animated program to make comedy out of Homer being placed in an outlandish situation. The tone is light and fun, and the main vehicle of its comedy is the concept of Scorpio, someone who plots world domination while also treating his employees extremely well. A product of the John Swartzwelder era of The Simpsons, Homer's Enemy is an archetypal episode of the show. It examines the premise of a normal person moving to Springfield and having to confront the reality of being co-workers with Homer if he was a real person. This episode came out in Season 8, around the time the show had fulfilled much of its purpose as a realistic portrayal of a family. By this point, the writers were beginning to embrace the show as an animation, taking advantage of what outrageous premises they could do with the medium. In Homer's Enemy, Hank Azaria, the voice actor for Moe, plays Frank Grimes, a new character introduced in the episode. The episode begins with the news special explaining Grimes' life on television, explaining all the hardships he endured as a youth before finally getting his certifications as a nuclear technician. Mr. Burns sees the special and is emotionally moved, asking Smithers to find Grimes and hire him so he can make him his executive vice president. The next day, Smithers comes in with Grimes, but Mr. Burns has completely forgotten who he is. Having watched a new special on a heroic dog, Mr. Burns tells Smithers to find him, and he wants to make the dog his executive vice president instead. On arriving at the plant, Grimes meets Homer, Lenny, and Carl. Grimes is immediately turned off by Homer's boorish behavior. Learning Homer got his job just by showing up at the plant, Homer annoys Grimes by putting his face on the glass, eating Grimes' lunch, and chewing on and abusing his custom pencils. Grimes tries to ignore Homer but begins to resent him, sharing his concerns with Lenny and Carl. Things escalate after Homer, while sitting in the break room, goes to drink from a beaker of acid. Seeing this, Grimes intervenes, rushing forward to stop him just in time, spilling the acid on the wall of the room. Though he has just avoided dying, Homer laughs, which enrages Grimes, who admonishes him. Walking through the hall, Mr. Burns sees the wall has been damaged by acid, and instead of punishing Homer, punishes Grimes for the damage and reduces his pay. After this, Grimes confronts Homer in his office, where he tells him that the two of them are enemies and he should stay away from him. The episode then switches to its secondary plot, where Bart and Marge go into the city so Marge can get a custom license plate for her car. Wandering away out of boredom, Bart finds him in a property auction, where he spontaneously bids on an item for $1, not knowing what he is buying. Going up to the auctioneer, Bart learns he has bought an abandoned factory downtown, which he turns into a playhouse with Milhouse, sitting in the foreman's office like an executive, watching objects melt by throwing them in industrial waste, and rocking dangerously on abandoned scaffolding. The episode then returns to Homer, who becomes the primary point of view character. Having been completely obvious to his effect on Grimes the whole time, he is devastated, and confides to Marge and then Moe, who recommends he invites Grimes to dinner to try to ingratiate him. Inviting Grimes over after work, Homer tells his family to be perfect, a huge change from No Disgrace Like Home, and, in this capacity, everything goes well. When Grimes arrives, the family is dressed well and Marge is cooking lobster for dinner. Grimes is in awe of the size of the Simpsons' house and the fact they have 2 cars, saying he lives above one bowling alley and below another bowling alley. Homer then shares he's been to space, showing a photo from Deep Space Homer, and that he is friends with Gerald Ford, showing a photo from 2 Bad Neighbors. Homer then shows Grimes Lisa, Maggie, and Bart, causing even more resentment from him, with how successful his kids are. Instead of ingratiating himself, Homer has turned Grimes against him more, who laments how much he suffered in life, while the incompetent Homer has been so successful. Grimes tells Homer that he is what is wrong with America, that in any other country he wouldn't have survived with his levels of laziness and irresponsibility. He then leaves the family politely, Homer completely failing to win him over as a friend. Homer is upset the next day, but goes back into work with Marge's encouragement. The primary perspective then switches back to Grimes, who is unimpressed with Homer's efforts to look more professional at work. While talking to Lenny and Carl, Grimes points out that accidents have gone up every year Homer has worked as safety inspector, something he has never been admonished for or disciplined about. Grimes then comes up with a plan to embarrass Homer, taking a flyer down off the wall and taking it in his office to edit it. The flyer is an ad for a children's model building contest to create a power plant of the future. Cutting out the parts of the flyer that limit it to children, Grimes then leaves it on Homer's desk. Homer then leaves work early to work on the contest, although he smashes Grimes' car in the process of doing so. When the models are due, Ralph Wiggum and Martin Prince show their contest entries to Mr. Burns. Ralph's model is a renamed Malibu Stacy set, appealing to Smithers but no one else, while Martin's sophisticated model is literally able to light the room, but is seen as too cold and sterile for Mr. Burns. Going on stage after them, Homer shows his model. He explains he effectively copied the plant as it currently is, but added a racing stripe, fins, and macaroni noodles, changes that provide no improvement to the existing plan whatsoever. Impressed, Mr. Burns awards Homer the prize and the crowd cheers at him, causing Grimes to start having a nervous breakdown. Unable to understand why Homer is so successful, Grimes starts imagining himself as Homer and mimics his daily antics, calling out how incompetent he is while listing how many goods he enjoys in life. While doing this, Grimes grabs 2 high-voltage wires in the plant without safety gloves, electrocuting himself and dying in the process. The episode ends with Grimes being buried in the cemetery, Reverend Lovejoy presiding over the funeral. At the ceremony, Homer falls asleep and calls out to Marge to change the channel, while Homer's friends laugh and celebrate him as Grimes' coffin is lowered into the ground. Homer's Enemy is a dark comedy and embraces the unreality that can be done in animation. It does something The Simpsons rarely does, which is kill a character, but it does so to communicate its theme, trying to make an argument about nihilism. The episode seems to say that life isn't fair, and Homer actually is a character that we can look up to. He knows how to laugh at himself and the world's hardships, and despite his incompetence, he's managed to carve out a pretty good life for himself. Instead of obsess over the ideas of fairness and injustice, and all the million and one ways the world has wronged you, we should embrace the world as it is and be able to laugh. The Shining is a satire of the Stanley Kubrick film The Shining. A part of the fifth Treehouse of Horror special, in the short, Homer takes on the role of Jack Nicholson's character. The episode opens with the family departing to Mr. Burns' version of the Overlook Hotel, the title cards mimicking those made by Kubrick at the start of his film. At the hotel, Mr. Burns and Smithers are leaving for the winter, and Mr. Burns says he's going to turn off the cable and take all the alcohol out of the building to ensure he gets a season of honest work out of his caretakers. Smithers argues this may be why the last caretakers went mad, and Mr. Burns concedes that if it happens again, then he owes Smithers a Coke. While in The Shining, there is a long, suspenseful buildup of Jack Nicholson's madness. Part of the comedy in the short is how quickly Homer goes insane after losing television and cable. Is Dad going to kill us? Asks Lisa. We're just going to have to find out, replies Marge. One of the best scenes from The Shining is the Simpsons satire of the typewriter scene. Marge fearfully approaches Homer's typewriter in the main room of the hotel, saying that what he has written down will give her an insight into his madness. The joke comes when she sees he's written "feelin' fine," but then turns back in horror when lightning reveals Homer has written "no TV and no beer make Homer go crazy" all over the walls of the room. The two then reenact the scene where Shelley Duvall holds off Nicholson with a bat, with Marge swinging it while Homer makes psychotic exclamations at her like Jack Torrance. Marge successfully hits him, then locks Homer in the ice cellar, but he's then let out by Moe and the ghosts of the hotel in a manner similar to The Shining. Like in the Kubrick film, Bart uses his psychic powers to summon Willie, the caretaker, to help the family, but Willie dies suddenly on arrival from an axe blow, just like in the real film. Homer reenacts the frightening axe scene of The Shining, breaking down the door trying to get at his family before following them outside into the cold. Finally, when he's about to strike them, Bart shows him the portable TV dropped in the snow by Willie. Pacified, Homer calms down and gradually makes his way out of his madness. The family then sits around Homer watching the television in the snow, the cold gradually freezing them as they reach the morning. This episode shows the resilience of animation, that it can do comedy as well as horror, and shows the artistic dynamism of the writers, who, though they're working on an animated comedy show, appreciate Stanley Kubrick too. The episode also shows us how much television pacifies us, that without it we're forced to confront our existential angst and sit alone dealing with our own inner struggles. It's truly difficult to pick a best episode when the four I listed are so exceptional. But I think the best episode of The Simpsons is You Only Move Twice. It makes excellent use of animation, creating a scenario which wouldn't be possible on a live-action show. It creates one of the most iconic characters, Hank Scorpio, still memorable after only one appearance. It creates an absolutely hilarious premise, a supervillain who wants to take over the world, but who's extremely friendly and generous to his subordinates. Given how much of the dialogue was the product of improvising, it shows the talent of Al Brooks as a comedian. I think it's ultimately the high concept of You Only Move Twice that marks it out as the best Simpsons episode.